Dr. Jenny Goodman, welcome to the podcast. It's good to be able to speak with you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to see you too, Alex.
Yeah, so we're going to dive today into, I guess, the content from your book, Staying Alive in Toxic Times, that was released. It was earlier this year that it came out, wasn't it?
It was January, about 6 weeks before lockdown.
Brilliant. Good timing. So I think a lot of what is within that book is really appropriate for, what's happened this year, ultimately.
Yes.
Before we dive into it, Jenny, would you be happy just to share a little bit of I guess, who you are and your background for people that might not be aware of you yet?
Sure. Well, I qualified as a doctor a very long time ago, 1982. And when I went to medical school in 1976, I think I was very naive. So at one of my first interviews for medical school, they said to me, "Tell us, Dr. Goodman, why do you want to be a doctor?" And of course, I came out with the standard line, "I want to heal the sick." And they all roared with laughter. And in fact, I shouldn't have said it. I'd been warned that it's uncool to say that. So I changed it to say, "I'm fascinated by human biology," which is also true. And then they said, "What are the most important characteristics for a doctor?" And I said, "Intelligence and compassion." And again, they roared with laughter and said, and I quote, "Go and be a bloody social worker."
Wow.
So that's to give you an example of the machismo, the macho ethos that was medicine then. And of course, I did want to learn to heal the sick, and I still believe passionately that's what medicine should be about. But what they taught me was how to manage symptoms, how to suppress symptoms, using drugs, radiation, surgery, and all the things we know have side effects that require further medication, and so on, in a cascade. So who I am is a person that found that very difficult. I went through medical school, I became a junior doctor, I did the whole thing. But all the way through, I was asking not only, how can we really make these people better? Because they weren't getting better, they were just getting different sets of symptoms. But also, my overriding question was, always has been and still is, why do these people get sick in the first place? What are the causes of illness? And having been told at that interview that actually what was needed for a doctor was a scientific mind, I agree with that. You need that and general intelligence and compassion, of course. But what constitutes a scientific mind? Now, to me, it is somebody who's always asking why, who's looking for causes, not just for repeating patterns. And therefore, by looking for causes, is able to do prevention, real preventive medicine. So everybody you see as a junior doctor in hospital has been getting sick for a couple of decades. Their heart attack or stroke or cancer hasn't come out of the blue. So I wanted to delve back into the earlier and the subtler levels of pathology, of how people become ill. And what I've been lucky enough to learn only in the past 20 years, really, through discovering the British Society for Ecological Medicine, is that there are causes and you can address them and you can make people better without making them worse. And it's all to do with what goes into our bodies. And that's not just what we eat. It is, of course, what we eat and drink, but that's just what goes into our body through swallowing. There's also what goes into our body through skin contact, what we touch, and what we inhale. And we're all acutely aware of this now in a very narrow and distorted way in terms of not wanting to inhale or touch a particle of the virus. But actually, we are surrounded by toxic chemicals that we're touching and inhaling all the time. And almost all of that we can do something about. So that's my passion, really, is to help people understand the root causes of illness and what we can do about it in terms of environmental toxicity, in terms of nutrition, diet, and the obvious lifestyle things that everybody knows about, diet, plenty of sleep, fresh air, exercise. And in my book, I go into some detail, but not too much, about what I mean by a healthy diet. And it's a lot more relaxed and I would say less fundamentalist than a lot of what's out there. There's 4 guiding principles and the rest is a way of working out what works for you, for your body at this particular moment in your life, and also depending on the season of the year. right? So the way we need to eat in the middle of the winter is not the way we should be eating in the middle of the summer. Our sleeping, working, exercising patterns need to be different. So although the book is called Staying Alive in Toxic Times, the subtitle is A Seasonal Guide to Lifelong Health. And one of the things I talk about in the winter chapter is the kind of food and supplements that prevent winter viruses. Now, of course, I don't have prophetic powers, and I did not know COVID was going to happen. But what I would say to any potential readers is read the winter chapter until the pandemic is over. Pretend it's winter in terms of not how to live, but in terms of what to take, in terms of supplements, because that is where I recommend the golden trio of vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc, all in substantially larger doses than is normally given. And every single patient of mine that is doing that has stayed clear of COVID.
Yeah.
And perhaps if I can tell you a little snippet about this, very recently I had a consultation with a patient whom I've been working with for a fair bit of time, and who is, for other reasons and for her general health, taking a jolly good dose of vitamin C, vitamin D, and zinc. She recently nursed her young child through a very serious bout of COVID. He was in bed for 2 weeks. She was cuddling him, comforting him, looking after him, often all night as well as all day. She said she was drenched in his sweat and he was coughing in her face. Now that is a very high viral load. She did not get ill. She has remained well. And at the end of his illness, they both tested. He tested positive, she tested negative. And that is a very empowering story. And I was very heartened to hear it, because these things are in our own hands. And if we give our immune system the right tools, it can fight the virus.
Yeah,
you can ask me more about that later if you want. I know we're not here just to talk about COVID.
No, I think it's a really powerful story and is very much testament to this concept of ecological medicine. But for now, we can certainly return to the idea of seasonal living, because it's something that I think deeply resonates with me as well. But I would love to expand on what you mentioned earlier around your 4 golden rules.
Oh, yes. In terms of how to eat, I've come up with 4 golden rules that I think do apply to everybody. And beyond that, it's about the individual. So the first one, and these are going to sound very basic because they are common sense. The first one is eat your greens. And this has been known forever. You know, your great grandmother probably told you, and there are many reasons for it. First of all, greens act like a kind of brush. I mean, leafy green vegetables, you know, like cabbage, broccoli, spinach, all of those. They go through the intestines and through the bowel like a gentle brush, sweeping all before them. Okay. And the reality of it is, if your bowels are regular, if you can poo properly, then you can think clearly and you'll feel great and everything else falls into place. And so that's not number one. And as I say, it's not new, but it bears repeating. And of course, the question people ask is, should I eat my green vegetables raw or cooked? And there are factions about this. It's extraordinary. There's a raw food only faction and there's a cooked food only faction. Well, I'm saying yes and both, of course. And of course, more raw in the summer, more cooked in the winter, and find your type, because some people, their gut really can't cope with too much fiber raw, but it can cope with a lot cooked. And the nutritional benefits are different. So what you get if your green vegetables are raw is loads of vitamin C and loads of antioxidants. What you get if they're cooked is a greater ability to absorb the minerals from them. The minerals are there if they're raw, but many people absorb them better if they're cooked. So that's golden rule number 1. Golden rule number 2, here comes a big challenge, is cut out sugar. Now, I don't mean stop eating fruit, but I do mean stop eating the artificially added sugar, which means almost everything. So if you're still eating packaged and processed food from the supermarket, check the ingredients list, because even savory foods have had sugar added to them. Why? Because it's addictive and therefore it's profitable to the manufacturers. And if you look at the ingredients list, and you need your magnifying glass to read a lot of them properly, especially if you're my age, you will see a lot of words you haven't heard of ending in O's, O-S-E. Sucrose, dextrose, maltose, they're all sugars. Anything ending in O-S-E is a sugar. Now, cutting sugar out is extremely difficult. So can I say a word about why and how to make it easier? The reason it's difficult is not because you are weak-willed or giving into temptation. It's because we are actually programmed by evolution to crave sugar. So if you think back, 100 or 200 generations, however many it is, when we were hunter-gatherers, longer ago than 10,000 years, for most of our history, for hundreds of thousands of years, we were cave dwellers or forest dwellers, and we were hunting and gathering. So it was beneficial to have a built-in sugar craving, because the only source of sugar we were ever going to encounter was berries and fruit, occasionally, and possibly all the year round at the equator, but in temperate zones only in the autumn. And what we did was we gorged on that fruit, and it kept us going for the winter. Bears still do this. We look at bears, they eat loads of fruit, lay down fat for the winter, they're hibernating, and they've got nothing to eat. So it was a programmed in survival mechanism that we should go towards this fruit and honey occasionally and have loads of it, because it would keep us going. But that very same built-in mechanism, which had survival value in hunter-gatherer days, has become a liability because we are in a sugar-laden environment. And Professor Robert Lustig talks about this very clearly in his book, Fat Chance. It's not your fault. It's the fact that we are surrounded everywhere we go by chocolate bars, ice cream, biscuits, cakes, and any one of those probably contains more sugar than your ancestors had in a whole year. So it's not that sugar per se is poisonous. You can't really overdose on sugar by eating fruit unless you're a diabetic. It's about quantity. It's about how concentrated it is. So we've all become addicted. And there are a few tips in my book about how to break that. And the first thing is stop beating yourself up. It's not your fault. The second thing is change your environment, because if you have the cakes and biscuits in the house, you will eat them. So make sure it's not there. And secondly, actually get lots of exercise, because exercise surprisingly can reduce your sugar cravings. Most importantly, eat lots of things that are not sugar. If you have regular meals with protein in them, something like, a vegetable omelette for breakfast or an egg and salad for breakfast. I'm not saying no carbs. You can have some wholemeal toast if wheat isn't a problem for you, or you can make some homemade gluten-free bread, because the shop-bought stuff is full of sugar. You can have eggs and bacon with a salad. You can have porridge, and you can have it savory with salt, cinnamon, whatever, and oil. But don't have sugar. And then at lunch, have a really substantial meal, and at dinner, have a really substantial meal. If you get hungry in between, you can have a savory snack like a bit of avocado or some nuts and seeds. Please notice, I said nuts and seeds, not nuts and raisins, because raisins are very full of sugar. If you eat regular, real food, the sugar cravings will get much less, substantially less. And lastly, there are certain mineral deficiencies which I have found make people's sugar cravings worse. So for example, if you're low in magnesium or zinc or chromium or manganese, all of which you can get tested at BioLab in central London, that will make your sugar cravings worse. But also the more sugar you eat, the more you drain those nutrients out of your body. So you break the vicious circle by eating non-sweet foods regularly and topping up on the minerals. And forgiving yourself, because you will break your sugar-free resolve from time to time. But of course, the other problem about eating too much sugar is it feeds the unfriendly bugs in the gut. So, if you want to get rid of yeast, Candida, sort out your microbiome, first step is to stop feeding them sugar. Second step is to feed them probiotics. So there are two more golden rules. The third one is cut out all artificial additives. The fillers, the artificial sweeteners, the colorings, the thickeners, the texturizers, the emulsifiers, all this rubbish that they put in packaged food none of which should be there if it were real wholesome food in the first place. So again, get your magnifying glass, read the ingredients list, and hopefully sooner or later you'll stop buying anything that's processed or packaged and just cook real fresh food like your grandparents used to. It's quite shocking what they put in our food. So, you know, you see kids walking around with a blue chin because they've been eating a blue ice lolly. It's blue because it's got blue dye in it. And I think I say in the book somewhere, if you were dyeing a t-shirt, you wouldn't suck it, you wouldn't suck the dye. And yet we're feeding our children dyes, which we know are associated with bladder cancer and breast cancer. The evidence is all out there, but it's still legal to sell this stuff. Okay, the fourth and final rule that I think applies to everybody, and when you've applied all these four, then you go on to find out what your specific needs are, what to eat, what not to eat for you. The fourth one is more challenging and more challengeable, and that is to eat organic and free range. So free range only refers to animal foods. So if you're a vegan, you can switch off at this bit. Free range means chickens that have really been running around freely all day, not for 1 hour out of 24. So again, read the label carefully. They've been running around and pecking and living like chickens ought to live. So they've had a happy life and hopefully a merciful death. And it means that the cows or the sheep or the pigs are also out in the field and not, you know, kept in cruel factory conditions like battery hens. Organic applies to animal and vegetable food. And it doesn't mean anything special or unusual or weird. Organic is ordinary food, again, like our great-grandparents ate, which hasn't been sprayed with pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. In the case of the animals, hasn't been injected with hormones. And now we're leaving the EU, it's going to be legal for our meat to be injected with hormones, like estrogen, which contribute to our epidemic of breast cancer. And also animals that haven't been fed on antibiotics. Why do they give so many antibiotics to farm animals? Because they're kept, unless they're free range, in such atrocious conditions, so cramped and miserable that, of course, their immune system suffers from the stress. And so they keep getting infections. So the vet keeps coming to give them antibiotics. And so their immune system gets worse. And you eat the antibiotics. If you eat an animal that isn't free range and organic, you're eating antibiotics, and shortly you'll be eating hormones too. And those animals, of course, they do pee out on the field, just like, you know, women who are on the pill or HRT are peeing those hormones out, and they're in the water, and we're all consuming them. So the last thing to add about that really is going back to what I was saying about at the beginning about what really is scientific ways of thinking, is look at the epidemics we're facing. We know we have a pandemic of COVID right now, but we have had a pandemic of cancer for some decades. You know, I asked a room full of people just before lockdown, 50 people, I think, how many of you know somebody with cancer? Every single hand in the room went up. Now, if you had asked that question of an equivalent room full of people 100 years ago, would it maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 hands? Not 100. It's crept up on us and we haven't noticed. But we should be far more frightened and concerned about the epidemic of cancer, heart disease, dementia. Alzheimer's was very, very rare, even 50 years ago. Diabetes, which is completely rampant, millions of people. And that's the pandemic we should be worrying about. And a truly scientific medicine would be saying, why is this happening? And the reasons are clear, they're all in the book. And what can we do to prevent it? And the action we can take to prevent it is both on a collective and an individual level. The collective level is mostly to do with reducing levels of air pollution, which is poisoning us. But on an individual level, if you're spraying air freshener in your toilet, or you're getting horrible toxic cleaners out from under your sink to clean the oven, there are safe, natural, and much pleasanter alternatives to all of those. So throughout my chapter on toxicity, I describe what you can do instead of using all those chemicals we use in our homes for personal care, whether it's cosmetics, shampoo, you know, for cleaning the bathroom, for cleaning the kitchen, for cleaning stains off the carpet or off your clothes. There are safe, natural alternatives to all of those. The one that's a bit tricky is nail varnish, but with nail varnish, you just put it on outdoors so you're not inhaling it. Once it's dry, it's no longer a problem.
Okay. Brilliant. I love the fact you brought in sort of the environmental sides to antibiotics being in our food system, because I think that's such a big one that many don't fully appreciate yet, ultimately.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something?
Yes, I was just going to say that the medical profession is starting to realize the dangers of antibiotic resistance, and that if they keep giving everybody antibiotics to fight every bug, instead of strengthening the immune system nutritionally so it can fight its own battles, that eventually we will end up with bacteria, and this is about bacteria, not viruses, because antibiotics kill bacteria, not viruses. We will end up with bacteria that are resistant to every antibiotic we've got. Now, we know that's already happening. We've got Clostridium difficile, C. diff, in our hospitals. We've had for many years MRSA, multiply resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And so the GPs know they should try and pull back on antibiotic prescribing. But as I say, if you're not eating organic, you are eating antibiotics with every meal. And that's less so if you're vegan, I have to admit. I mean, I'm not a vegan, that's a whole other discussion. But if you are a meat eater, you've really got to go organic. Otherwise, you're eating antibiotics. Sure. I wanted to say something about what to do about the problem of antibiotic resistance. Obviously, we need loads of vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, a little bit of iodine as well, a little bit of selenium to give our immune system the tools it needs so we won't get infections in the first place, either bacterial or viral. But the pharmaceutical industry should be working hard on developing new antibiotics that will fight the resistant bugs, but by definition will only be used very sparingly. Because any antibiotic that's given out like Smarties, you will get resistance. The bacteria are quick learners. This is not happening. Why is it not happening? Because it's not in the interest of the pharmaceutical companies to spend years researching and developing something that must only be used very sparingly, very occasionally. And this is one of the problems we've got because our drug industry is totally private. It's all about profit. And I would like to see a national pharmaceutical service, because without that, without a not-for-profit organised pharmaceutical system, the NHS is always going to be in hock to the drug companies.
Yeah, that's a lovely idea.
Heard it here first, people.
Yeah. And actually, just going back to your second golden rule for a second, you mentioned certain organisms like Candida, for example, that can be involved when we're on the topic of sugar. Do you find that it can work the other way as well? And what I mean by that is people who do have a Candida overgrowth or dysbiosis have a tendency sometimes to have cravings for sugar as well.
Yes, thank you very much. That's another vicious circle. And the reason they have more intense sugar cravings is it's not the person that's doing the craving, it's the yeast. Right? It's conquered you, it's occupied you, and you are doing its bidding. Now, we know that yeast love sugar and feed on sugar. If you've ever baked bread, and nearly 9 months into lockdown, most people have at some point baked their own bread, you know that you put in the yeast with warm water and you put in a little sugar or honey to feed the yeast. Now, that makes a huge difference. The yeast multiplies, it divides like crazy. You get bubbles in bread because that's the gas that the yeast has produced. And it does the same in your stomach, but instead of baking bread, it makes farts and quite unpleasant and sometimes painful trapped wind as well. So basically, every time you eat anything sweet, the unfriendly yeasts and some unfriendly bacteria in your gut, they think it's Christmas. They have a party. And the next day, you're full of wind and it's uncomfortable for you and the people you live with.
Yeah. So just to expand on this maybe a little bit more, because a lot of our community, and certainly over the last decade of working with clients, there seems to be almost a theory that people have like a Candida overgrowth and that's why they have the symptoms they have. It seems to be more popular than a bacteria imbalance.
Yeah, it's a bit of a catch-all, isn't it? It's like if you've got IBS, if you've got anything wrong with your gut, you've got Candida. So basically I do stool tests a lot. I see what's growing in people's poo. And you do get Candida. It's not always Candida albicans, the one that everybody writes about. Quite often it's other yeasts, and quite often it's yeasts and bacteria, unfriendly ones. And sometimes it's just unfriendly bacteria. And sometimes those are bacteria that are expected to be there, but only in tiny amounts, and they've overgrown. So it's not so much about what you've got as what the balance is. So we're always going to have a tiny amount of Candida in our gut. It's a natural inhabitant of an anaerobic environment. It's when it overgrows that you get the problem, when it takes over. And what's happening inside our guts is very equivalent to what's happening in our farmers' fields, where they're growing monocrops. They're just growing one thing. So we're just eating one thing. Okay? They grow just, let's say, wheat, and we eat just wheat. And that makes the fields liable to attack by pests. And then you put pesticides on the pests to get rid of them, like we put antibiotics to get rid of the unfriendly bugs. And again, you go round in a vicious circle. So if you cut out the sugar, you're starving the unfriendly yeasts and you're starving the unfriendly bacteria, but the good bacteria will thrive. They don't need the sugar, so you won't starve.
Okay. And you mentioned a few symptoms that could be associated with Candida, but I guess could also be associated with bacterial imbalances.
Yeah. With any microbiome imbalance in the gut, you will get, not always, but usually gut symptoms like constipation and diarrhea, either alternating or even at the same time, which is possible, and discomfort and gut pain. But you will also get a degree of brain fog, not being able to think clearly, and your mood will be affected. And one of the things that people notice when they really improve their gut function is that their brain is clearer. Yeah. This is not just a bodily thing, because all these unfriendly bacteria, they have their own metabolism, and they give off waste products which are absorbed from the gut lining into the bloodstream. They head to the brain, and of course now we know that's not the only route they get to the brain by. They also are carried directly in the myelin sheath of the vagus nerve, which is a direct pathway from the brain to the gut and back again. So your brain is profoundly affected by what's happening in your gut. And of course, your immune system is profoundly affected by it too, because most of the immune system is in the gut. It's like a little brain inside the gut in its own right. And you know, there are lots of tips in my book about how to make it easier to stay off the sugar and what to eat instead. And it isn't just about what you eat. It's about when you eat, how you eat, where you eat, whether you're absorbing properly, where it was grown, all those, and is it in season? And is it right for your metabolism, which changes at different times of your life? So I've got a whole chapter in there, chapter 5, called Seasons of Your Life. So, you know, the nutrition you need if you're 1 year old is different from the nutrition you need if you're 91 years old.
Are there any big themes from a lifetime perspective? I mean, I've done some reading recently around protein, for example, and how needs change throughout the lifetime.
Yes. Well, I think it's very individual. I mean, I think when you're a new baby, you need lots and lots of protein, but you need to be drinking your protein. You need to be breastfed, because human babies need human milk. And I do bang on about this a lot in the book, because it makes a difference to your health for the rest of your life. So if there's any potential young parents listening, go all out for the breastfeeding. And guys, you've got to support your woman to do this, because breastfed babies hardly ever need to go to the GP. On average, 0.5 times in the whole of the first year. Bottle-fed babies, on average, have 11 visits. But that's the only stage in your life where you need to drink your protein. So however hard you're working out at the gym, it's closed now, but you know, as an adult, you don't need protein shakes, you don't need protein drinks, and you also don't need so-called protein bars, because they're not, they're all full of sugar if you read the ingredients list. You just need protein food. You know, if you want protein before or after the gym, have an egg, you know, have some chicken, have a piece of fish. That's the protein that you need. People's requirements vary enormously. And largely, I would say this is trial and error. But trial and error will only be accurate if you've put those 4 golden rules in place. And then you will find, for example, some people can manage on just vegan protein. You know, they can manage on all the pulses, the split peas, the lentils, the beans, peas, and so on, and the nuts and the seeds, which is the extent of vegan protein. Other people just cannot. They've got to have some animal food at certain points. Usually your protein requirements are most when you're growing and when you're in your 20s, and they get a lot less later in life. So, you know, in your 60s and 70s and 80s, usually you can manage with less protein. But the great thing about sticking to the 4 golden rules is that then your body will be, if you like, cleansed of distractions and addictive foods, and your body will give you accurate messages. Just like in pregnancy, women get cravings for certain foods and aversions for certain foods, and up to a point, if it's not a sugar craving, you follow that. So the healthy body that stopped eating sugar and artificial stuff and is just eating real food will give you accurate messages, because there's a world of difference between a craving and a felt experience that, oh, I'm really pulled towards that beetroot and that celery, and I've never wanted that in my life before. And you know what? I really don't want that beef steak. Your body will tell you. Most of us, I think, will end up eating meat or fish maybe 2-3 times a week maximum. None of us need it every day, but there are some of us who can't manage without ever having it. So again, I go back to the hunter-gatherer paradigm, because our bodies have barely evolved at all since we were hunter-gatherers. That 10,000 years of agriculture is a tiny snippet of time in terms of evolutionary time. They would have had, our ancestors, they'd have had maybe once a month, they'd have caught a big animal and feasted off that, had meat intensively for 2 or 3 days, and then probably nothing in between except plants. So they would have been vegan most of the time, but they would have had the occasional meat feast. And, you know, I have to say, I completely admire the vegans' critique of our cruel factory farming methods, and I absolutely wouldn't buy that stuff. You know, we have to only have free-range, cruelty-free animals if we're going to eat animals. But A, we need far less, but B, some people really can't manage without. And among my chronic fatigue patients, a huge proportion are vegetarian or vegan. A huge proportion. Now that's not a representative sample, because obviously the vegans and vegetarians who are healthy and happy eating that way don't have to come and see me. But some of the severe chronic fatigue patients can only get better if they will have a little bit of some animal food. And it's not just about minerals and vitamins, it's about carnitine and CoQ10 and all those things that the mitochondria need. They're little organelles inside your cell that produce energy in order to make the energy molecule ATP and keep you going. So you can find out most of this for yourself by following the 4 golden rules and my description that I call Suck It and See, of how to find out what works for you. But it won't be the same at every stage of your life, and it won't be the stage at every season of the year. And if you're a woman, it will change utterly when you're pregnant, and it will also change at menopause. And really, your body should be the authority on what's working for you, rather than anybody's theory.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, what was I going to say? Oh, what are your thoughts on sort of the nose to tail idea of if we are eating animal products to include a little bit of liver or heart or kidney as well for kind of the nutrient density of those organs?
Thank you, Alex, for reminding me of that. That is absolutely right. And that's what tribal peoples who are still living as hunter-gatherers today do. The bit they're least interested in is the bit we prize, the muscle meat. Sometimes they throw that away or give it to their dogs. They go for the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the brains, the bone marrow, and the fat. And by throwing all those things away, we are getting deficient in vitamin A, vitamin D, all of the minerals, and B12 from the brains, and all sorts of nutrients we probably haven't yet discovered. Just like there are phytonutrients in plants we haven't quite identified, I think there are in animals as well. And it's ironic that we're taking a lot of supplements to replace nutrients that are there in organ meat, in liver and heart. And really, those were highly prized right up until the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, that's absolutely right. Some people will eat liver, some people will eat heart, but that's where most people feel they have to draw the line, which is a shame.
Yeah, it is a shame. I guess, if people aren't willing for whatever reason to eat these organs, because I appreciate, they do come with a bit of a texture and a taste. There are some good quality supplement companies now. So there's a way of supplementing these kind of organs if that's kind of the best option that we have available to us as well.
Yes, but I think we need to learn how to cook them and overcome our squeamishness.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Onion and garlic and fresh herbs and all those sorts of things with those foods. But a word of warning, only eat liver if it's from an organically farmed animal. And I mean one with the Soil Association approval, because the liver is our organ of detoxification. And if the animal has been, ingesting pesticides, insecticides, weed killers, all that sort of thing, antibiotics, hormones, they're all going to be in the liver. So liver strictly organic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, earlier, and in your book, you mentioned the idea of it's not just about what we eat, but when, where, how, whether we're digesting it, etc. Is there anything that you could or would like to expound on from a when perspective?
Yes.
Because do you mean by that, obviously we've commented on the seasonal element of things, which falls within this, I guess, but is there things from almost a daily perspective that you're thinking of there as well?
Okay, so I am not about to specify particular times of day because that is the most individual aspect. All right, so I wasn't meaning you must have breakfast. Some people must have breakfast and other people really can't eat breakfast. They probably shouldn't wait till lunchtime. They should probably have a substantial, healthy, non-sugar snack at 11 o'clock. It used to be called 11s. But you can't make rules about that. I mean, it isn't good to eat last thing at night before bed, right? So most people should probably try and have dinner earlier rather than later. And most people, but not all, need to eat 3 times a day. But it's immensely varied. And it also depends on what you eat. So I've got patients who, when they've changed their breakfast from eating Weetabix or cereal with milk and sugar to eating eggs and bacon with a salad, then they don't need lunch. They can carry on till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's very individual. But what I meant by the importance of when you eat is, what are you doing when you're eating? Are you eating in a rush? Are you grabbing a crappy sandwich at your desk? Or have you gone for a walk? Are you sitting down and just eating and nothing else, and focusing on the food, enjoying the food, taking your time to swallow and digest? Because if you're eating in a rush, then you are eating in a stressed state in which you cannot digest properly. In other words, love your food and make time for it. So we know that the autonomic nervous system, that's the unconscious part of the nervous system that we can't control, the part that makes you sweat or makes your heart beat, gives you goosebumps if it's cold. That autonomic nervous system has 2 halves, like yin and yang. It has, and the names are historical and they don't tell you much, but it's called the sympathetic nervous system, which is about fight and flight. And I would say fight, fright, and flight. And that's the one where you're on high alert. So all the blood is diverted away from your gut, away from your skin, to your heart, lungs, muscles, and brain. And that's when nature's making you ready to shin up a tree, get away from a lion, fight an enemy, whatever. And that's for emergencies only, in evolutionary terms, but we're in that state a lot of the time. The opposite state is the parasympathetic, which can be summarized by the phrase rest and digest. And that's where all the blood and oxygen is going to your gut, not to the brain or the muscles. And so that's when you can digest, you can chew properly. So in other words, you have to get yourself into a parasympathetic state in order to digest properly. So it has to be a time where you really are just eating, you're not on the run. There used to be a thing called a lunch hour. And maybe now so many of us are working from home, that's been reinstated. But certainly 50 years ago, even for high-powered office workers, that was absolutely sacred. You stop, you have an hour for lunch, and what you're doing is eating your lunch. and that enables you to get calmer and into the parasympathetic state. I think that's why so many cultures stop and say some kind of blessing before a meal. It's not about the words, it's about saying, hey, just stop. Let's appreciate this food, and let's appreciate what it's doing for our bodies, and let's chew it slowly and let's taste it, because you will digest it a whole lot better. I mean, digestion begins in the mouth with the saliva mixing with the food. So yeah, don't gulp it down.
Yeah, it's so true. I
It's
was
so
actually,
obvious, isn't it?
yeah, no, it is. And I think it's sometimes almost frustrating how obvious and simple some of these powerful strategies can be. But I was reading around the cephalic phase of digestion recently. So the sight and the
He said
smell.
cephalic, not phallic,
Oh,
people.
cephalic. Okay, thank you. And they were
Or
talking about
cephalic, anyway, CE. Yeah, meaning to do
CE.
with the brain.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and they were sort of from animal studies how, up to 25% of pancreatic enzyme production is produced within that phase, which is quite remarkable, really. Because
Meaning just the sight of the food or the smell of the food.
yeah.
Yeah,
So that sort of
yeah,
food preparation is still
that's
part
right.
of the digestive process, really.
Yeah, so you have to have real food, because real food has got a smell that will get that going. Now, you get a sandwich from Tesco's, it doesn't smell of anything, it doesn't taste of anything, it won't get your digestive enzymes going. So pack lunches when we're back at work, guys. And the best packed lunch is the leftovers from last night's dinner.
Yeah,
You know, cold
definitely.
homemade chicken curry with vegetables, salad, whatever.
Yeah, shepherd's pie for us today.
Okay, great, with some greens.
Of course. Brilliant. Is there anything that you would like to conclude with, Jenny, today? Is there anything we haven't yet touched?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked that much about detoxification, about getting the junk that's all around us out of our system, as well as trying to avoid it in the first place. And I do say a lot about both of those in chapter 7. But I think that it's important to name just a few basic methods for getting the environmental toxins that we have in our systems out of our systems. The single most important thing I would say is vegetable juicing. And I do describe in great detail how to do it, what kind of juicer, what to put in, what not to put in. Because raw vegetable juice gives you so many concentrated phytonutrients that you'd have to be chewing salad from dawn to dusk to get that amount. So it's like drinking your salad as a medicine. Epsom salts baths is very good because the sulfur in the magnesium sulfate helps the detox pathways, especially those involved with detoxifying estrogen. And the magnesium, of course, helps get rid of the heavy metals, and it goes into your muscles and relaxes them. Another favorite method of mine is colonic hydrotherapy, kind of hard to come by at the moment, but you're not just clearing out the bowel, you're waking it up, like giving it a massage, reminding it to do its job, and most of all, you're cleansing the blood supply that goes from the large bowel to the liver. So the liver has got less toxicity going to it and is therefore better equipped to deal with the environmental toxins. And the fourth thing is sprouting, growing little seeds, mung beans, alfalfa, whatever, baby lettuce on your windowsill and just eating them. So there's also saunas, again, very difficult to do at the moment, but I describe the right way to do it, because just sweating doesn't get rid of toxins, because your skin absorbs the sweat as soon as it's on the surface. So you go into the dry sauna and you take a clean towel and you towel off the sweat as it appears, because what you're getting rid of is the fat-soluble toxins. Most of the air pollutants and other poisons in our environment dissolve in fat. So they will be held in the fat in the body, which of course includes the brain, but there's a layer of fat just under the skin from which they will be released in the sauna, but you have to quickly towel them off and then go and have a shower. And there's also high dose vitamin C. Vitamin C is completely magic. My colleague Dr. Sarah Myhill talks about this a lot as well. And there's a confusion about dose, as there is with almost all vitamins. So quick bit of history here. Most vitamins were discovered about 100 years ago, and it was thought that they were substances needed in tiny amounts to avoid particular deficiency diseases. So in other words, you've got no vitamin C, you get scurvy. You've got no vitamin B12, you get pernicious anemia. You've got no vitamin D, you get rickets, and there are many more. And that's true as far as it goes, but what they hadn't realised is that it's not either or. You've either got a fatal deficiency disease or you've got enough of this vitamin. There is a whole spectrum. So to be really, really healthy with a brilliantly functioning immune system and a clear bowel and a clear brain, you need about 1,000 times more vitamin C daily than you need to not die of scurvy. So when I'm detoxing people, I'll say you start with 1 gram of vitamin C a day, and you build up to 2, and you build up to 3, and you build it up until you reach your own bowel tolerance. And again, I describe towards the end of chapter 7 how to do that. And it varies enormously. But many people find it's brilliant for their bowel function. It's brilliant for preventing COVID. And you work out your maximum dose and you stick to it, certainly until the pandemic is over. So there are many other things you can do. There are specific supplements such as glutathione, which helps most of the detox pathways. Again, vegans should have some of that, because although you can theoretically make it from the amino acids in vegan protein, it's a tight thing. Okay. So yeah, there are all those things that we can do. But if taking supplements is part of your program, I would say 2 things. One is, the obvious question is, why do we need supplements? Can't we get everything we need from a healthy, balanced diet? Well, yes, we could before the Industrial Revolution, but now the soil has been so depleted by intensive farming and over-fertilizing that most of the nutrients that should be in your plants, your plant food, simply aren't there anymore. And that's very sad. And again, I describe it in more detail in the book. But so for that reason, some of us do need supplements some of the time, but take your magnifying glass to the supplement shop as you would to the supermarket, because a lot of them are full of cheap fillers and rubbish and actually quite nasty additives. So you want to make sure you're just taking good doses of the vitamins and minerals you want, and not a load of rubbish that's been added into it. And this was the bit I wasn't fully aware of until I wrote the book. How many popular, cheap, mass-produced supplements that you buy in the chemist or the supermarket, including those targeted at children, are just full of absolute rubbish. I mean, I was really shocked. It's a very short chapter, excuse me, chapter 6. It's called Nourish and Flourish. And it lists all the rubbish they put into certain supplements and how to avoid them.
Brilliant.
I just wanted to say one more thing.
Sure,
yeah?
Please do, yeah.
It's about the nature of evidence. What constitutes evidence? Excuse me. Because the case history I described briefly at the beginning about the mother who did not get ill with COVID and didn't even test positive, although her son was desperately ill and coughing all over her, giving a huge viral load. That is the sort of thing that conventional medicine would dismiss with the phrase anecdotal evidence. It's just anecdotal evidence, right? An anecdote is a tale, a story, and it is a derogatory term. It's dismissive. And what that kind of little case history snippet used to be called was clinical experience. In other words, the experience of the patient and the doctor, or the experience of the patient and the practitioner. And medical journals used to be full of this, and they still do have case histories. And I just want to put in a plea for taking those sorts of case histories and clinical experience accumulated over the decades seriously as an equally valid form of knowledge, because randomized, placebo, double-blind trials, RCTs, are also a very important form of knowledge, but they're not the only form. And they can only tell you about the population. They cannot tell you about the individual in front of you. And there are many subtle things they can't test. So, for example, there was an RCT that showed that giving vitamin E wasn't a good idea. It made people worse. But when you look at what kind of vitamin E they were giving and what a ridiculously low dose, and the fact that they weren't giving anything else with it as a nutritional practitioner would, and they weren't changing the diet, you think, well, that's an area where the randomized controlled trial is actually quite useless.
Yeah. No, that is a really important point. And I think so much of what you've said today is incredibly powerful. And I think what I love about it is, although it's powerful, it's still relatively simple in regards to what we should be focusing on. And it's going back to those basics that you say, you know, our great grandparents, this is their natural way of living in I guess, a slightly simpler time in some ways.
Sure.
Certainly in regards to options that we now have available to us and the knowledge, the conflicting knowledge that we now have.
The very fact that we are asking the question, what should we be eating, would have been incomprehensible before the Industrial Revolution, because we ate what grew, when it grew, and where it grew. So I'm trying in the beginning of the book particularly to cut through all these tangled fads and fashions about diet, you know, only raw, only cooked, only vegan, only meat, lots of fruit, no fruit, all that sort of stuff. Because none of the many, many diet plans that are out there are wrong. They're all right for the person that wrote them at the moment of their life when they wrote them.
Yeah.
So my book is about how to find your own way through that.
Yeah, that's a really great point, actually, because that's very true for a lot of the diets out there. They were born out of the person's struggle and what worked for them. Yeah.
And they've all got useful bits in them. Can I just show you another picture of the book?
Yeah, please do.
Staying Alive in Toxic Times, a seasonal guide to lifelong health. And I didn't know COVID was going to happen, but hey.
Yeah, I reread.
It's more relevant now.
Yeah, no, I reread bits of it this morning just to remind myself for today's conversation. And when I read the winter month around vitamin C, D, zinc, I was like, oh, okay, that's highly appropriate.
And also a little bit of iodine and a little bit of selenium.
Yeah. And magnesium is in the book as well, although I'm not sure that will be as relevant now.
Well, magnesium and all the B vitamins are very, very important now, not for direct immune support, but for mental health support.
Sure.
Because the B vitamins and magnesium are crucial for your brain and they're crucial for your sanity. So yes, we need those as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent. Dr. Goodman, thank you so much for sparing the time. I think it's going to be a really popular episode because it's just packed full of helpful information for all of us, and it cuts through the noise, as you say.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed talking to you.
No, thank you.